So when people are impacted by conflict zones, we often see they're not traveling far distances. And if they are, it tends to be because a lot of times they'll have the money and the wherewithal to make those trips or to send people on those trips. So many of the folks that we're seeing in Western economies coming from Syria or coming from places that are impacted in the Middle East by conflict zones are the people who have the financial wherewithal to send people, because you have to pay smugglers, you have to pay people along the way to get you there. It's often substantially cheaper to just stay relatively close to home in a neighboring country.
ESG has exploded into compliance and business consciousness in 2021. Join Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, on the ESG Report and learn about sustainability risks, opportunities, and issues that business leaders and compliance professionals need to know about regarding ESG.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Welcome to another episode. And today I have with me John Katsos. There's various ways I can introduce John, but I've decided I'm going to introduce him as HBR published author John Katsos, because he's the only guy I know who's published articles in the Harvard Business Review, but that's just a small snippet of his work. So John, first of all, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tom, and Happy New Year.
John, as I mentioned, wrote a series of articles for a recent HBR article or series on the big idea. That led to a conversation. That led to one podcast. And this has led to this podcast because John has worked outside of the United States internationally in a variety of, probably the best word would be hotspots, over his career. And I wanted to maybe explore with him how some of the issues that he has seen in conflict zones, areas where climate change has been particularly prevalent, lead to corporate responses such as ESG. So John, I hope I got all of that right. And if I did, could you tell us a little bit about what you're up to now?
Yeah, sure. So again, thanks for having me on the show, Tom. It's always fun to talk. So yeah, right now we're principally organizing a couple of different studies. One of the big ones is to take a look at how multinationals and small and medium enterprises are interacting in 5 conflict zones. So our focus right now is on Myanmar, Ukraine, Ethiopia, Northern Ireland, and Iraq. And so the hope is to see, because these 5 conflict zones are in different stages of conflict. Some of them are coming out of conflict and trying to really move towards not just post-conflict, but really move towards more stable societies. And others are in the midst of conflict, and still others are sort of in the lead up to it and sort of in pre-conflict phases. So that's a big project I'm working on now. In addition to some of the other I'm working on a book with my colleague Jason Michaelian, and working on sort of other articles as we go forward. Usually, again, focusing on businesses in conflict zones and how they can make places better instead of making them worse.
So, John, I wanted to maybe start with an exploration of how you see sectarian or other conflicts, as well as climate change, driving migration. And as you know, I'm in Texas, southern border of the U.S. We've seen economic migration, certainly my entire lifetime in Texas. But something seems to have changed in terms of migration. And I don't recall a time since perhaps World War II when we saw a lot of displaced persons migrating, that we saw such a wide range of migration from different areas across the world, literally from Central America to the United States, from the Middle East to Europe, from Central Asia to Eastern Asia and others. So I was wondering if you might just set the stage and how do both of these problems or issues drive migration that you've seen?
Yeah, so it's a great point. I think what's changed is the scale. But what hasn't changed is that environmental factors lead to migration, and they also lead to social strife. And these sort of all work together. If you look back just civilizationally, human civilization has been all about migration. So for most of human history, we've migrated from place to place, largely in response to either social and political issues, or more normally, we've migrated as humans because of environmental issues, right? So the climate changes. This is a thing that does happen. What's changed lately, so what's different about this century is again, the scale, both in terms of how quick the climate is changing, but then also the scale of the number of people that it's affecting. So if you look 100,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, the number of people simply isn't nearly as large as it is today. And also the scale of the climate change and the rapidity of it is not the same. So to give you an example of how this plays out, a lot of people look at the Syrian civil war, a lot of scholars look at the Syrian civil war as conflict that took place in the aftermath of climate impacts. So there were a series of once-in-a-century droughts that hit Syria more or less year after year after year in the early 2000s and sort of into 2010. That led to a migration internally of Syrian farmers, people who used to be living off of the land, into larger cities. So into Damascus, into Aleppo, into understandably larger city centers so that people could find jobs, so people could make money to feed their families, because previously they would have been out in rural areas with no problem, right? They would have had more than enough food to eat. As a result, that increased the pressure in those cities and increased all sorts of social pressures that were taking place. And that was a lot of the spark or a lot of the motivating factors that then pushed Syria into a civil war, where those issues that existed before were there. Right? So the issues that caused the Syrian civil war didn't emerge out of nothing. But the pressures that were put on the Syrian government from having all those people now in the cities and really paying attention to what they were doing made what was an already difficult situation much, much worse. So again, that's how it plays out in sort of more recent times. But this is a phenomenon that's plagued humans for basically the entirety of the human race's existence on Earth.
Could we characterize the Irish potato famine and the Irish migration from the 1840s and early 1850s as climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I would say those are, whether it's climate change or just environmental catastrophes that hit particular places and then force people to migrate. Yeah. I mean, I think when you look at a lot of the migration that happens to whether it's to the United States or to other places that aren't suffering from the same environmental issues, you see time and again that people move to where there's not only jobs, but they move to where there's food and where there's the ability of the land or the government to be able to sustain them. And I don't think that's going away. In fact, again, I think it's getting worse because of the scale. We just have a lot more people than we've ever had as the human race. Right? So globally, there's just so many more people, and we're all getting the environmental impacts, or globally, there are environmental impacts that are happening at the same time. So whereas something like the Irish potato famine might have been isolated, right? So it's isolated to a particular location environmentally. What's happening with climate change is we're seeing environmental degradation and destruction globally. So it's not something that you can just isolate to one place and say, okay, well, we'll deal with this narrow group of people from this small place. Instead, we're having to deal with lots of people from lots of places. And the ability of countries to manage that is becoming more and more difficult.
John, if I could turn maybe to focus on conflicts, sectarian or other, as opposed to climate change. You've also studied those issues. What does the role of conflict, actual war, civil war, revolution, rebellion, or any other moniker we might put on it, play in the migration you've observed?
Yeah, lots. I mean, so I think those are the two main drivers of people to leave, are political instability and violence on the one hand, and then environmental issues on the other hand. Sometimes those go hand in hand. So and again, the Syrian civil war is a nice example of that, where they're coming together. What I think you see most in conflict zones is people move around, but don't. In sort of the US and in Europe, we often think about people coming to us from conflict zones. But as you rightly noted, one of the largest migrations related to the aftermath of World War II. It was really people coming from neighboring countries to their next door, right? And something similar has happened in Syria, where 95% of Syrian refugees are in countries that border Syria. So when we talked about, a few years ago, we talked about these large waves of migration coming from, in particular, Syria. Most of those, that didn't represent the largest proportion of Syrian refugees, right? Most of them went to Turkey, they went to Lebanon, they went to Jordan. They went to places that were neighboring where they could easily be able to get back, potentially, to their homes and to where they wanted to be. When we see these sort of waves of people coming, what's remarkable is that that's still not as big of a fraction of the general sort of global refugee population. So when people are impacted by conflict zones, we often see they're not traveling far distances. And if they are, it tends to be because a lot of times they'll have the money and the wherewithal to make those trips or to send people on those trips. So many of the folks that we're seeing in Western economies coming from Syria or coming from places that are impacted in the Middle East by conflict zones are the people who have the financial wherewithal to send people, because you have to pay smugglers, you have to pay people along the way to get you there. It's often substantially cheaper to just stay relatively close to home in a neighboring country.
And how does this migration caused either by climate change or conflict really lead to potential worker or personal exploitation of people?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. So on the one hand, you have a lot of people are coming in legal ways, obviously, but then there's many people who are using more or less criminal networks to get them in or out. And those criminal networks are often then exploiting people in other ways, right? So the moment you come into contact with these organizations, you leave yourself open to the potential to be exploited. Either they just take your money and don't deliver the services, or they use you for other things or force you to do yet other things. The issue on the business side is that very often companies with large spread out supply chains are not paying nearly enough attention to how those networks can then leverage their power over people to make it appear as though someone is working voluntarily when they're really not. And this is it's a sort of a constant challenge in the supply chain. It's not that there's no way to deal with it, but it means that it's something that companies have to be focused on to try to make sure that they're not using labor that's being exploited. The second part of that is that often when people are coming in from other places, especially when they're in moments of economic desperation, they're putting downward wage pressure on jobs that otherwise might have higher wages. And so what the less reputable companies are doing is sometimes they're then using that labor that's much cheaper and that is often off the books, right? They're not paying taxes on it, or they're paying limited taxes on it, to be able to undercut the prices of their competitors. For the ethical businesses, this is a real challenge, right? Because you see this going on. You see that maybe your competitors are doing this, and you're put in a position where you might be undercut on prices. You just have to sort of stay the course and hope that put pressure on your government to enforce the rules and to make sure that they're going after the people who are doing those sorts of things.
John, I'd like to now turn to the role of corporations, corporate response, and leading to ESG responses. You have researched and written about a variety of topics up to and including the corporate response. So if I could maybe start with as broad a question as I could think of, what's the role of a corporation if it's trying to do business ethically and in compliance in a conflict zone?
Yeah, I think if you're coming in, there's two types of businesses to think about, and I'm going to focus on the first type. So I think the issues for companies from outside those conflict zones are different from the ones that are already there and maybe are local, right? So are not, foreign-based companies. But I'll focus on the first group because I think that's sort of where your question is driving at. For those groups, I think the first question is, why are you there, right? Are you there because if you're just there for exploitative reasons, right? So if you're there to take something out as quickly and efficiently as possible and sell it somewhere else, you need to be really careful about where your funding is going, who you're paying, who you're employing, and how your operations are working next to or in concert with conflict actors. So there's people who are bad people in those locations, and you have to be very, very careful that your operations are not helping the bad people, and then in particular that your operations are not impacting innocent people negatively. So doing no harm is the key principle in all of these locations. Your operations should not be funding gun runners, right? Your operations should not be funding regimes that are committing genocide or directly helping those regimes do those things. That's, I think, the first key critical question. And then from there, after you figure out, okay, why are we there? You can then figure out, do we need to be there, right? So sometimes withdrawing is worse for the people on the ground and for the conflict than staying on the ground, right? Than maintaining a presence. So sometimes companies are supplying necessary jobs, necessary goods like foodstuffs that are actually helping to make the conflict not as bad, right? So they're making it better. But each company is going to have to make that determination. If you're extracting oil out of the ground, you have to ask yourself, what's the likelihood that you're making things worse by making tax payments to governments that are doing bad things, or having to pay protection money, which is a fairly typical problem in conflict zones.
How does a company, or how would you counsel a company, perhaps would be the other way, to perform due diligence to assure that, number one, the people they're doing business with aren't on any of the bad guys list. Number two, some of these extra judicial payments you've mentioned that don't get caught in that broglio, and that you're paying the monies you owe as an extractor or other business to a legitimate government, or at least one recognized by Western countries.
The most important thing to do is to ask yourself, can you do effective due diligence? And if the answer is no, in a conflict zone, you have to assume that the worst is happening. And so you're flipping the script and basically saying, look, if you cannot do adequate due diligence in a conflict zone, you've got to have a baseline assumption then that your operations are in some way doing harm. If you have that default, if your default is, if we can't do it, then it means it's happening. Or if we can't measure it, if we can't see, if we can't send inspectors, if we can't do the audits, if we don't know where payments are going, we have to assume that they're going to the wrong places. I think what you'd see is two things. So first, you'd see conflict actors, and especially governments, making sure that you could do your due diligence. And so we've seen this in a couple of locations where companies basically say, look, if we can't do due diligence, we're going to withdraw, right? Make it very clear. If we can't actually assure that the money we're spending is going where it's supposed to go, we can't be there anymore. And so that puts pressure on the people who can make it happen to allow the due diligence process to run its course. And then the second is, if it can't run its course, you have a plan for shutting down that portion of your operations that you can't do due diligence for. I think companies need to have those processes in place and think more seriously about them. Some companies do. So I think you see especially energy and mining companies that have gotten into trouble before are a little bit more focused on what does it mean for us to withdraw.
This is Tom Fox again. Due to some technical difficulties, this ends our interview with John Katsos, but he had so much great stuff in the first few minutes. I thought we should go ahead and post this because it definitely gives you some different ways to think about how some of the issues facing the planet on a global basis, such as human trafficking, such as climate change, really lead directly to your ESG program. I hope you will join us again for another episode of the ESG Report. Thanks again.